it was a homicide case. There was co-actors involved in the case, and the co-actors were in a consensual sexual relationship and engaged in some activities that they photographed that were, I guess you could say, outside some normal sexual activities, and some activities that probably most people aren't going to the local Walgreens to have developed into hard copy photographs.
There you go. So that's why I had you explain this, because the law degree brings that out much more tactful than it may have been.
Brought to you by Defense Forensic, where we find the truth in data.
Welcome to our podcast, Digital Forensics Redefined. I'm Rob Walensky. I'll be your host this week. And this week we have a guest, Monroe County, Wisconsin prosecutor Kevin Croninger. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Kevin?
Sure. I'm the district attorney of Monroe County, Wisconsin. I've been the district attorney for approximately 9 years. I handle everything in our office as far as types of cases. So I've handled things from speeding tickets all the way up to homicides, and I'm a district attorney who actually goes to court. I have some assistant district attorneys who provide a lot of assistance with that, but unlike some bigger places, we get the privilege of actually appearing in court and handling cases in court.
Sure. So when you say prosecutor, for people who may not be familiar with prosecutors or attorneys in general, what is your role? Who do you represent? What type of cases?
Sure. Yeah, and it's different, I think, in different places too. So in Wisconsin, we have elected district attorneys. I am the elected district attorney in Monroe County, Wisconsin. In my county, we handle everything from speeding tickets up to homicides, meaning we represent the state of Wisconsin. We advocate for appropriate outcomes for victims. We attempt to get people held accountable for criminal acts that they commit within the confines of Monroe County. And so that really kind of summarizes very generally what we do.
Sure. Many of the cases that you handle are major criminal cases.
Yep.
All the way up to traffic, or down to traffic tickets, I should say.
Yep.
Kind of did that backwards. But you and I have known each other for, gosh, got to be
as long as I've been in Monroe County, so I guess that's about 12 years now at least.
Yeah.
Sometimes it seems like longer, but it's
got to be, what, 2011, right?
I think so, yeah. April of 2011 I started there. So
yeah, as a assistant for the former DA who passed away, Dan Carey.
Yes, learned a lot from Dan.
Sure.
Great man.
Yeah, great mentor, great guy to know, and to kind of started me out in my career as well. So
yeah, taught a lot of people a lot of things, and very instrumental in me becoming the prosecutor I am today.
Sure. So you and I have worked a number of cases. I mean, we probably got stories we could tell for forever.
Good ones and bad ones, yeah.
Yeah. Some that need to stay in that little box, maybe.
Nothing stays in the little box. We're the state. I'm the state, so everything we do is public.
Everything is discoverable. Yes. Yeah. One of the cases that sticks out to me was it was a homicide case that we were prosecuting. Well, Kevin was prosecuting. I was the detective, and we're in mid.
You think you're prosecuting sometimes. It's a different thing. Sorry, go ahead. Sometimes
I feel like I could, or I've been in court enough.
Not as easy as it looks, but anyway, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. We're in a mid trial. I don't know. What are we, a week or something into this?
I think 7 or 8 days. Yeah.
Into a homicide case, and I had done some forensic work as the officer in the case with a cell phone, and somehow mid-trial it becomes relevant all of a sudden. We think we might need some photos that happen to be on one of the defendant's phones, and so I need to get these photos ready by the following morning. So I get asked to do this. Well, the photos were, I guess, for lack of a better term, a couple of individuals and some compromising.
Yeah, I guess you could call them the co-actors of the case. It was a homicide case. There was co-actors involved in the case, and the co-actors were in a consensual sexual relationship and engaged in some activities that they photographed that were, I guess you could say, outside some normal sexual activities, and some activities that probably most people aren't going to the local Walgreens to have developed into hard copy photographs.
There you go. So that's why I had you explain this, because the law degree brings that out much more tactful than it may have been. But in any event, I end up going to Walgreens at 6 or 7 o'clock at night. I intentionally waited till I thought it wouldn't be busy, because I got to explain to these people who I am and why I need them to develop print some photos like that. Obviously they're looking at me sideways, and I end up getting all these photos printed and take them into court the next day. And then we got a judge ruling, I think, that wouldn't necessarily allow us to admit those into evidence for whatever reason. So
yeah, and I think part of the thing, a couple of things I'd point out, well, for the attorneys or those familiar with the court system who may be thinking to themselves, why didn't Kevin just display the photos digitally? At the time in our courthouse, there wasn't as good of a way to do that, and so I wanted hard copies of the photos because I figured the judge would have some issue with them. The other thing I think that's important to point out about this is, I mean, we knew these photographs existed, you know, from the time the phone was dumped, so to speak, but we didn't know we were going to need them until the defendant was testifying. And so the defendant testified for the whole 8th day. I think it was the 8th day of trial. It might have been the 7th. And I was in the midst of my cross-examination of the defendant, and I thought the photos became relevant because they went to his conduct after the act and what their intent was. And so I wanted to be able to demonstrate these photos that there wasn't, you know, any sort of remorse or anything else, that this was just they're having a party and doing all sorts of what some people may think is odd stuff. And so it kind of became something that we needed urgently because of some of the, and this has now been fixed in our courthouse. We have a new courthouse. Some of the technological implications, we needed those photographs printed. And so I think, to me, it highlights an important issue with digital forensics is you never know what you're going to need in the middle of trial, and you have to be ready to present what comes up. And whether you're a prosecutor or a defense attorney, whoever you are, you don't know what's going to come up in the middle of a trial, and you have to be ready for it. So.
Right. Well, and that kind of leads into the point of the podcast here, is that in this particular case, we had this evidence all along very early on in the investigation. We didn't know what was relevant. And at that time, you know, we're talking a number of years ago, so the technology has changed a little bit and things like that. But the content, you know, it was provided to the defense and everything. But nobody, I don't even think that anybody could have predicted that those 10 photos or whatever it was would have became relevant, just the way the evidence comes in. So it's kind of nice in that regards. With when you and I worked together, I was there. I did the phones. I had that expertise to be able to then extract those photos, get those images made so you could utilize them in your presentation. So.
And at least give us that option. I mean, I think, you know, how relevant they were. I mean, the judge probably disagreed with me a little bit, and that's fair. The judges don't always agree with me. I always say if they agreed with me all the time, they wouldn't be doing their job. But you know, to have that option to be able to do that, and there's countless other examples in much less significant trials where stuff like that has come up. I can think of lots of drug cases where we have text messages where I need to cross-examine a defendant on that. You just don't know what's going to come forth, especially on the state side, but I think it's true on the defense side too, is you don't know what the state's necessarily what their case is going to be, what arguments they're going to make, and you got to be able to be agile, I guess, in your presentation.
So how do you determine things like that? How do you determine if initially you need, you know, digital evidence from whether it be a phone or a computer, now not more recently vehicles, you know, if it's needed, and how do you decide who or how to hire somebody or who to have do it?
Yeah, so a couple questions there. I think the first thing is deciding in what evidence you need. I mean, that I think applies to whether it's digital or something else. Is it relevant to the case? Does it help prove the guilt or innocence of the defendant? And I, as a prosecutor, think it's really important that I look for things that show innocence as well, right? I mean, I don't want to incarcerate someone who didn't do something. So I always want as much evidence as I can get. I think there's limitations to what's practical, and you also don't want to waste someone's time or waste resources when you don't need to. But I think looking at it and saying, was this device, whether it's a car, a phone, a computer, was this device used in this event in some way? Is there evidence contained within that device that's going to show one way or another? From my perspective, whether that's guilt or innocence, I want it even if it's going to show innocence, because I want to know what's there. And then is there from my perspective, a legal way to get to that? Or can I work with the defense to get a stipulation to get to that? Because sometimes that happens too, is I don't have enough for a search warrant, but I think, hey, if I go to the defense attorney and say this might be exculpatory for your client, let's get a consent. That happens rarely, but it does happen.
So a lot of times it sounds like, and I think we would agree on this, that, the process, even, regardless of what the evidence is, it starts early. It starts in the investigative stage. I mean, to collect this stuff and to preserve it properly is huge. So you have that decision and those options as the cases progress. It may be that a cell phone, for example, isn't relevant down the road, but you don't know that. So if it's collected and preserved, you have the option if it does become important.
Yeah, and there's a balance, because we don't want to be, let's say you have a shooting and there's 10 people there. Do we want to take everybody's phone? I mean, we want to be mindful of their rights too. But I think it's important that we gather things that are potential relevant evidence, because we don't know. When you first go to a homicide scene, you don't know what's relevant. You don't know all the facts. You have to collect those. And so keeping that open mind is really important on the state side. And I think that's really important too, if you're defending someone, is keeping an open mind about where is this going to lead, and being able to be, like I said, agile in your presentation, agile in what you collect. So.
Does how do you decide, when you're going to use an expert, or who that expert is, whether it's a law enforcement expert or somebody from the outside?
So, part of that on the state side, we have some, I know it may not seem like it, we have some limit on how much money you can spend, but I think the other thing that I think is important is not all experts, and I use air quotes on that, are created equal. And I think Rob was at this trial with me. We had a defense expert who came into court and purported to be an expert, and failed to properly button and zip up his pants before he took the stand, which, in front of a jury, that defense attorney has told me since then that was the worst expert he's ever called, and will never call that person again, I believe. And that just doesn't set up well, right? So you want to have someone who's qualified. I think that's the first thing I look at is one, do I know this person? Do I know someone who's used them before? If I don't, can I look at what they've done? Can I look at their history and say, yeah, that's somebody who's credible on that? Because I've also seen that from experts, is they say they're an expert in digital forensics. They say they're an expert in something else, but they're not really. Right. I think sometimes you just got to have the conversation, right? You got to talk to people and ask questions. And if they won't answer your questions, if they don't take your questions seriously, they're probably not a real expert, or they're not the kind you want in court anyways.
Right. Well, I mean, just to the point, the example you made, whether this guy had his fly buttoned or didn't, and the hearing had no bearing on his knowledge or anything, but his presentation to the jury, just the perception is there that, he may not be as professional as.
Yeah, and his presentation wasn't very good. I mean, I enjoyed very much cross-examining that particular detective.
Sure.
It was a lot of fun. So I think sometimes, everybody leaves their fly down every once in a while, but when you're going into something that serious, usually you double check. I mean, there's things you can judge people on, I guess is what I'm saying. And I'm not saying make preconceived judgments of people, but have a conversation. Ask questions, ask probing questions, see if they seem to have a knowledge of the area. And if they don't, maybe get somebody else. And if they do, they should be able to teach you a little bit along the way, I think. So,
Sure. Do you regularly or routinely use like computer experts or cell phone experts or that technology in cases? I mean, is that common nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. I think the sky's the limit on that, so to speak. I mean, you can use that in almost every single case, I think. I rely on you a lot, obviously, for questions about stuff. And so my life is pretty easy because I have someone who I know pretty well who I can go to and say, what do you think about this? Is this nonsense? Is it not nonsense? For other people who may not have that resource like I have, I think there's other ways you can do that. Reach out to other attorneys, reach out to people who've used other people to do that. Because I think any serious case, it's going to involve some sort of forensics. I don't see how, I guess in Monroe County, Wisconsin, we have Amish people. Those serious cases sometimes don't involve digital forensics, but otherwise pretty much every case has some aspect of it.
Right. Yeah, everything. I mean, nowadays, even right down to vehicle crashes and everything you do is recorded somewhere. It seems like we have a lot of trouble or a lot of issues obtaining video. Everybody's got a different DVR system and set up, and that in itself, and then being able to actually utilize, footage and things and incidents that you're doing, stuff like that. But The cell phones, everybody's got at least one phone, it seems like. That's become big. But yeah, it's the relationships you build as well, where you've got somebody you can call. You know, if I have a legal question or something, it's nice to have someone from my side, from the prosecutor side, where we can run things off and ask questions. And you can ask the tough questions too, you know, things that you may not be comfortable talking to someone you don't know necessarily.
Yeah, and I think part of being an expert in any field, whether that's digital forensics, the law, anything else, is someone who's willing to admit when their knowledge is limited and is willing to share that knowledge. I mean, I don't trust experts who won't share any knowledge with me at all. When they just say, I know it all, and you'll hear about it in court. I don't play that game, and I don't like that game, right? Because you should be able to explain to me in a pretty simple way what the topic is you're going to testify about.
Sure. And sometimes you got to limit the scope of it too. I mean, you don't want them necessarily talking about a car that might have been involved when they only processed the cell phone in the case or whatever.
Well, and as an expert, if you're going beyond what your expertise is, the other side, whether that's the prosecution or the defense, better be hammering you on that, because it makes it look like you're just doing it for a paycheck, which is a problem, right? We're searching for the truth, not searching for, who can make the most money on each side.
Right.
And so I think having an expert who can admit that they have limited knowledge or admit what their limitations are is really important, and then holding them to that, right? And I think there's good ones and bad ones. It's like anything in life. It's like attorneys.
What I found, especially in the medical, a lot of times we have medical experts, and it almost seems like there's a medical expert on one side and a medical expert on the other side. They've looked at basically the same facts, and they have two totally opposing opinions. Sometimes in death cases, we have that cause and manner of death and things like that. So yeah, my point, I guess, is I agree that especially you have to maintain your credibility, and the truth is actually what matters here. So, and a lot of times what I found is, an expert report that I may review for you or whoever, a lot of times I agree with their findings. They've done the work the right way, and you have two opposing experts that may even agree. I mean, it's not always adversarial.
Yeah. Well, and I think, so a couple of things I'd say about that. First, I think sometimes it just, sort of backs up what you've already said. And sometimes it gives you a new perspective on something. I've dismissed a case before because I talked to a pathologist for the defense who told me, well, the cause of death or manner of death could have been this. And I can't say one way or another. I talked to my expert, my pathologist, and he said, I agree with him. So,
right.
That would not have been fair to prosecute that person for that.
Right.
And so I think, and the other thing I would say too is a lot of times when you have an expert do something for you, whether that's testing, whether that's a phone, forensic phone dump, a car, whatever it is, that person can also give you a lot of knowledge that's going to help you at a trial, right? So just because maybe that physical phone doesn't have exactly what you want, if you become somewhat knowledgeable as an attorney based on talking to your expert, you can then talk in a somewhat cognizant way with the jury about that, and it might make you look a little bit better than the opposing side if they don't have that knowledge, if they're confused about what's going on, if they didn't take the time to talk to their expert
Sure.
about it. I think that's a really important thing too, just as a trial advocacy point, is you need to know your evidence, and knowing your evidence is at least somewhat knowing what the expert testimony is going to be and what it relates to.
Right. Yeah, I mean, all these things are important to consider in these hearings. So any final thoughts on what we've discussed today?
Well, the only thing I guess I'd end with is, if you're going to get an expert, do your homework, do your research, and have conversations with them. Don't just because someone says they're an expert doesn't mean they're an expert. Talk with them, see what they have to say, and make a judgment for yourself.
Thanks for joining our podcast this week, brought to you by Defense Forensic, where we find the truth in data.
And before you go, please make sure to click that subscribe button and post any comments you may have about this week's episode below. Also, check out our website at defenseforensic.com for more information on the services available for individuals and organizations that require expert analysis of digital evidence.
And once again, thanks for watching, and join us next week for a new episode. And remember, the truth is out there.